Imagine, like, discovering that the foundation of your apartment building, I mean, that it rests directly on top of an ancient Roman blood sport arena.
Right, which sounds like a movie plot.
Yeah, exactly. But in Thessaloniki, Greece, that is not some hypothetical scenario. You step out to grab a coffee, you look at the asphalt, and you just assume you're walking on solid, boring infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely.
But, look beneath that pavement and that mundane commute completely shatters. You are walking over this massive, layered archaeological dig of human drama.
Yeah, we navigate these urban landscapes completely blind to the fact that we're tracing the exact footsteps of assassins and ancient artistic geniuses and, revolutionaries.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a huge stack of historical records, archaeological reports, and even some 1930s true crime files. And this analysis is actually part of our broader theme, Odromos Eki Tidikito Historia.
Right, which translates from Greek to the street has its own story. It's such a perfect phrase for what we're unpacking today.
It really is. So our mission today is to take you on a walk down 3 very specific streets in Thessaloniki. We're looking at Apellou, Vyrónos, which is named after Lord Byron, and Apellou Mela.
And the goal here is to uncover how history actually gets buried, right? Like how a single brushstroke defined an entire ancient era and how unaddressed economic trauma inevitably funnels down into these acts of desperate personalized violence.
Yeah, so let's just dive right into how history gets buried, because it's a battle between preservation and just modern survival.
Right, so let's start on Apellou Street, specifically at number 5. So there is this totally modern, ordinary abutment building there, but beneath it lies a colossal Roman theater stadium.
Wait, like a full stadium?
A massive one. We are talking about an entertainment complex that the sources estimate to be about 250 meters long. It actually predates the famous Palace of Galerius.
That is huge.
It is. And historical texts even tie it to the martyrdom of St. Demetrios, who was the city's patron saint. They note his execution actually took place in the basement of a bathhouse connected to this very stadium.
Wow. And the fact that this stadium even survived into the modern day is just, I mean, it's a masterclass in civic defiance.
Oh, completely. Because in the early 1990s, when developers discovered these ruins during excavation, the default mechanism of urban development just kind of kicked in.
Right, which is usually document it quickly, destroy it, and pour the concrete over it.
Exactly. And the landowner, who was this prominent lawyer and sports executive, he was fiercely determined to build his 8-story complex directly over the site.
But the citizens pushed back, right?
They did. A local radio station called Protogenes launched this massive campaign. They gathered 12,000 signatures to literally halt the bulldozers.
12,000, that's incredible.
Yeah, the pressure was so intense that Yanis Petaris, who was a prominent figure and actually part of the construction firm at the time, he recognized the historical magnitude of the find and just walked away. He resigned from the project in protest.
I love that detail. But the visual that stands out the most to me from these sources is Polixeni Adam Valeni. She was the archaeologist overseeing the dig.
Oh yeah, this is wild.
Right. When she faced the very real threat that the state might actually cave to the developers and bury the site, she and I think 4 other archaeologists, they literally jumped down into the excavation trench.
Yeah, they used their own bodies as a barricade.
She declared she would rather be buried with the ruins than let them be destroyed. I mean, that is just a visceral physical defense against the erasure of history.
And her gamble actually worked. It forced the state's hand. So in 1993, the government expropriated the land. And today, those ancient ruins rest preserved under a protective layer of fine sand.
Just waiting for a glass floor, right?
Exactly. The ultimate plan is to install a glass floor so you can literally walk over the past. But, the street sign hovering above this buried stadium, Apellou, it points us to a totally different kind of historical preservation.
Yeah, because the street is named after Apelles, the legendary 4th century BC Greek painter. And Apelles is this fascinating figure because he wasn't just famous. He essentially had a monopoly on imperial imagery. I mean, he was like an exclusive A-list celebrity photographer.
That's a way to put it.
He was the only artist Alexander the Great permitted to paint his portrait. Now, Napoleon later doubted that Alexander actually sat for him, but the ancient sources insist Apelles was the undisputed master of antiquity.
They rated Apelles superior to all artists before or after him. But what made Apelles a master wasn't like an abundance of resources. It was his severe self-imposed constraints.
Yeah, explain that because this blew my mind.
So our sources indicate he restricted himself to a palette of only 4 colors: white, yellow, red, and black.
Let's pause on that because imposing a four-color limit sounds incredibly restrictive for the greatest painter in the world. How does restricting your palette lead to mastery?
Well, think of it like the modern CMYK color model we use in printing today. Cyan, magenta, yellow, and black.
Oh, right.
By limiting those foundational variables, Apelles forced himself to master the physics of color mixing and layering to render the entire spectrum of human reality. And on top of that, he invented a secret, proprietary varnish called atramentum.
Right, and the sources mention that atramentum gave his paintings this unique soft glow and preserved them. But he took the recipe to his grave.
He did.
From an optical standpoint, though, how does a black varnish create a soft glow? Because that sounds totally counterintuitive.
It does, but it relies on altering the refractive index of the surface. So a dark, translucent glaze over a finished painting acts kind of like a polarizing filter.
Okay.
It tones down the harsh, bright colors, pushes the shadows deeper, and creates this three-dimensional optical illusion. It unifies the painting while simultaneously protecting the pigments from dust and fading.
So it's just a chemical and optical triumph.
Exactly. Total mastery of his materials.
And that level of technical obsession perfectly sets up the most famous anecdote about him, which is his rivalry with Protogenes.
Oh, the line story.
Yes. So Apelles travels to Rhodes to visit Protogenes' studio. He walks in, but Protogenes isn't there. It's just an old servant woman.
Right.
So Apelles walks up to a blank canvas, takes a brush, and paints a single, perfectly colored line across it. He tells the servant, "Tell him this came from me," and leaves.
Such a flex.
Total flex. Protogenes comes home, sees the line, and paints an even finer line in a different color directly inside the first one.
He wasn't going to just let that go.
Exactly. So Apelles returns, sees he's been challenged, and paints a third, impossibly thin line between the first two, leaving zero room for Protogenes to retaliate. And Protogenes just concedes defeat.
And that canvas eventually ended up in Julius Caesar's private collection in Rome before it burned in a mansion fire. It was revered as this absolute masterpiece of pure technique.
I have to push back on the physics of this story, though, because is this just ancient hero worship? How do you paint a mathematically perfect, microscopic third line inside two other lines using a 4th century BC bristle brush?
The skepticism is entirely warranted, honestly. Translating the Latin term they use for line can mean a drawn straight line, but it can also refer to an outline or a contour.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, some art historians argue they weren't drawing straight geometric lines, but rather competing to paint the most impossibly delicate contour of a figure, maybe a profile.
That makes a lot more sense.
Right. But regardless of whether it's a straight line or a contour, the underlying mechanism of the story is about absolute microscopic brush control and understanding the precise viscosity of the paint so it doesn't bleed. Apelles famously lived by the motto, "Not a day without a line drawn."
Total relentless discipline. And he demanded that same discipline from others, but strictly within their own domains.
Oh, the cobbler story.
Yeah. The sources recount him hiding behind his paintings to listen to public critiques. A cobbler pointed out a flaw in how Apelles painted a sandal, so Apelles secretly fixed it.
Right, taking notes.
But the next day, the emboldened cobbler started critiquing the subject's leg. And Apelles popped out from hiding and delivered this famous line, "Let the shoemaker venture no further than the shoe." Basically, know your limits.
Which is such a brilliant transition, really, because this idea of absolute obsessive control over every single variable stands in complete opposition to the subject of our next set of historical records.
We're moving from the strict discipline of Apelles to a man who actively erased boundaries and threw his entire existence into the fire of history, Lord Byron.
Exactly. So we move to Vyrónos Street, which honors that chaotic, passionate romanticism.
Both men were defined by their art, but Byron took his passion off the canvas and dragged it onto the battlefield.
He is basically the blueprint for the flawed romantic hero. I mean, he was born with a clubfoot, which caused him deep psychological insecurity, and he compensated with extreme behavior.
He racked up massive debts, right?
Oh, crippling debts. He engaged in highly scandalous affairs, including rumors involving his half-sister, and was essentially exiled from polite English society in 1816.
One of his lovers famously labeled him mad, bad, and dangerous to know, which is just iconic.
It really is. Yet his connection to Greece was deeply authentic. It was forged during his early travels. In 1810, he actually swam the Hellespont proving his physical endurance by recreating the ancient myth of Leander.
And in Athens, he penned Maid of Athens for a 12-year-old girl named Teresa Macri. He also weaponized his poetry for preservation. When Lord Elgin removed the Parthenon marbles, Byron launched this furious literary attack titled The Curse of Minerva, framing Elgin as a total vandal.
But his legacy isn't built just on poems. I mean, in 1823, during the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire, he arrived in Missolonghi.
And he didn't just lend his name to the cause, he liquidated his English estates and became a sort of sovereign bank for the revolution.
Yeah, the sources detail him spending £4,000 to refit the Greek fleet and another £6,000 just to pay off the unruly Suliot soldiers.
The economics of a privately funded revolution are staggering. Like, in the 1820s, £10,000 was an astronomical fortune.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the Greek provisional government was entirely bankrupt and hopelessly fractured. Byron's capital injection was literally the only thing keeping the naval fleet operational and the mercenary factions from just abandoning the defense entirely.
See, we hold Byron up as this grand savior, but looking at the logistics of his time in Missolonghi, wasn't he essentially just a walking ATM for warlords?
Wow.
Because he hired these Suliot soldiers, but the sources say they constantly mutinied, they demanded back pay, and they blackmailed him until he finally just fired them all. Was his military presence actually helpful, or was he just a wealthy aristocrat playing soldier and getting extorted?
The historical reality heavily leans toward the latter when it comes to military tactics. Byron secured absolutely no battlefield victories.
None.
None. He planned this grand assault on the fortress of Navpaktos, which completely fell apart due to the infighting of the very troops he was paying. The Suliotes operated on a strict mercenary economic model. They fought for the highest bidder and lacked the ideological cohesion Byron projected onto them. Militarily, his command was a failure.
Then how did he solidify his status as a national hero, if militarily he didn't really achieve anything?
Through the mechanism of international public relations and, ultimately, his sacrifice. While his military strategy failed, his presence internationalized the Greek struggle. Everyone in Europe was watching.
Right.
And furthermore, amidst the brutal, chaotic warfare, he maintained a profound humanitarian compass.
Oh, this is about the little girl, right?
Yeah. The sources highlight a moment where he rescued a 9-year-old Turkish Muslim girl named Hato and her mother. They were stranded and in extreme danger after the revolutionaries took Missolonghi.
Wow.
Byron provided for them. He even considered adopting Hato and ultimately arranged for their safe passage to Kefalonia. He treated the enemy's civilians with dignity in a war that was, frankly, characterized by ethnic slaughter.
That humanity, it's incredible. But that compassion cost him everything. He died of a sudden, violent fever in Missolonghi in April 1824 at just 36 years old.
Yeah.
He wrote shortly before his death, "I gave her my time, my health, my fortune, and now I give her my life. What more could I do?"
The Greeks responded by firing 37 cannon shots, one for every year of his life.
Well, so powerful.
And his death sent shockwaves through Europe. It transformed him into this untouchable martyr and really accelerated foreign intervention in the war. And, discussing Byron in this specific moment is incredibly poignant.
Why is that?
Because this year marks the 200th anniversary of the legendary exodus of Missolonghi in 1826.
Oh, wow. 200 years.
Yeah. That pivotal, devastating siege happened just 2 years after Byron died in that very same soil. He represented the absolute apex of romantic nationalism, a wealthy elite voluntarily liquidating his fortune and giving his life for a unifying ideal.
And that romantic ideal of the wealthy sacrificing for the poor, it creates this incredibly violent conceptual clash when we examine our final location.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
We're moving to Apellou Street, near Tsimiskí in the Diagonios area. Fast forward roughly a century from Byron's era to September 1938. The ideological framework of the city had completely inverted.
It really had.
Instead of a wealthy elite giving his fortune to the destitute for a grand revolution, we find a wealthy elite hoarding his fortune and being murdered by the destitute in a desperate struggle for basic survival.
Right. The architectural setting for this shift is Moskov. It's this stunning Art Nouveau and neoclassical building constructed between 1924 and 1930.
Today, you might recognize it as a National Bank branch, and for years it housed the famous Turkinless pastry shop.
But in 1938, it was the epicenter of a true crime that exposed the fragile socioeconomic architecture of Thessaloniki.
So let's talk about the crime. The victim was Nikolaos Moskov, who was a highly prominent and wealthy tobacco merchant. The assassin was Anastasios Agalides, a refugee from the Pontus region and a casual laborer in Moskov's tobacco warehouses. To understand how a casual laborer ends up assassinating a wealthy merchant, we have to look at the mechanics of the labor market at the time. Agalides was a free worker.
Translating that into modern terms, Agalides was trapped in the 1930s equivalent of a brutal gig economy, but entirely devoid of safety nets.
No safety nets at all.
Exactly. He wasn't part of a formal union, he was hired casually, and when the specific task ended, he was discarded with zero severance or compensation.
Which drove him to absolute destitution. He actually begged Moskov to reinstate him, and Moskov refused.
And Agalides received a meager amount of state aid, which was intended to buy a boat ticket to Piraeus so he could look for work elsewhere. But instead, he used that money to purchase a cheap, unreliable handgun.
And the assassination itself reads like a tense cinematic thriller.
It really does.
Agalides' first attempt failed completely because of that cheap gun. He ambushed Moskov outside his home in the Diagonios area, pulled the trigger, and the weapon jammed.
Moskov walked right past, completely oblivious to the fact that he was milliseconds away from death.
But the desperation driving Agalides didn't dissipate. He repaired the gun, stalked Moskov again on September 27th along Tsimiskí Street, and successfully shot him in the head.
Now, analyzing the historical fallout requires strict objectivity regarding the political and social climate here.
Right, because this wasn't some grand conspiracy.
Exactly. The historical records confirm this was an isolated event. It was not a mandated hit by a labor union, nor was it an organized act of coordinated class warfare.
The press at the time heavily emphasized that Agalides was a solitary figure. He was unmarried and didn't have a starving family pushing him to extremes. It was fundamentally an act of intense personal vengeance.
But, an isolated act doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right. If Agalides was acting entirely alone, why did this specific murder shake Thessalonian society to its core?
Because it served as a violently compressed symbol of the tectonic pressures building beneath the city. The massive chasm between the elite merchants and the destitute refugees had already ruptured just 2 years prior.
In 1936.
Yes. In May 1936, Thessaloniki experienced massive tobacco worker strikes that were brutally suppressed by the military and police, resulting in multiple civilian deaths in the streets.
So Agalides' gunshot basically forced the wealthy elite to realize that the poverty they were ignoring could reach out and touch them, even outside their beautiful Art Nouveau mansions.
Exactly.
You have two completely separate realities, the merchants extracting immense wealth and the refugees fighting for crumbs colliding violently on the pavement. And what I find most compelling about this source material is how that trauma was processed by the next generation.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
The descendant of the murdered merchant, Kostas Moskov, didn't hide from this history. He dedicated his life to dissecting it.
Kostas Moskov grew up in the shadow of that assassination and became a highly prominent writer, poet, and historian. In fact, he was also serving in Egypt in the 1990s as a cultural attaché.
Oh, wow. So he was deeply involved in culture and history on an international level.
He was. And his ideology is a key part of how he processed this. Our sources note that Kostas Moskov approached history through a Marxist and leftist lens.
Right.
In 1972, he published a deeply influential sociological work titled National and Social Consciousness in Greece. He formulated a theory of Thessaloniki as a comprador city.
Okay, comprador city sounds like dense economic jargon. What exactly does that mean in the context of this murder?
So, a comprador class acts as an intermediary or middleman for foreign economic interests. Kostas Moskov argued that Thessaloniki's elite didn't build a sustainable, industrialized local economy that elevated the working class.
So what did they do?
Instead, they acted as highly paid facilitators. They extracted local resources like tobacco and exported them.
Right, I see.
This economic model generates astronomical wealth for a tiny fraction of merchants, while leaving the labor force entirely expendable and destitute.
Which perfectly explains the environment that created Agalides.
Exactly. Kostas used his literature to map out how this exact systemic inequality engineered the violent intersection of class and survival that literally spilled his own grandfather's blood.
He synthesized his family's trauma into a mirror for the city's soul.
He really did.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started by looking at a simple street sign, Apellou, and dug down to find a preserved Roman stadium and the meticulous mathematical brushstrokes of Alexander the Great's personal painter.
Then we moved to Vyrónos Street, analyzing the economic mechanisms of Lord Byron, financing a foreign revolution, ultimately trading his immense wealth and his life for the immortality of a romantic ideal.
And finally, we stood outside Megara Moskov on Pavlu Mela, dissecting how the brutal gig economy of the 1930s drove a desperate man to assassinate a wealthy merchant, an act that perfectly crystallized Kostas Moskov's concept of the comprador city.
When you walk down these streets today, whether you're waiting for the glass floor to be installed over the stadium on Apellou or grabbing a pastry near the old Turk list spot at the National Bank, you are literally stepping on a physical archive.
The asphalt is merely a lid.
Yeah, the pavement is holding up the weight of ancient artistic obsession, of massive humanitarian sacrifice, and of desperate, fatal struggles for survival.
Every street is an ongoing narrative, which leaves you with a question to ponder the next time you step out your front door. If future historians were to excavate your street 5 centuries from now, or if they had to rename it based on the defining socioeconomic friction of our current decade, what exact story would the pavement tell about us today?